The mid-century masterpiece at the corner of Adams and Ocean Streets downtown is no longer a library, but it's still called the Hayden Burns Library, and probably no one in Jacksonville knows more about it than my guest, author and architectural historian, Dr. Wayne Wood. Wayne, how would you describe this building for somebody who's never seen it?
The Hayden Burns Library is Jacksonville's mid-century modern masterpiece. It is over a half a block coverage. It is the premier downtown mid-century building, but it's quirky, and I guess if you had to apply any adjective to it, it is that. It is covered on three sides with these amazing angular wings, fins that were popular on cars and such back in the 1960s. The building was built in 1965, and it was designed by architect Taylor Hardwick, who was one of Jacksonville's premier architects in the 60s and who went on to build many, many other great mid-century modern gems in Jacksonville. But this building stands alone as the masterpiece of Taylor Hardwick's career. Now, the interesting thing is, as much as we revere this building today, at one point it was widely desired to tear it down because it was so quirky and ugly, and I don't think it was ugly, but
it wasn't
people
that
thought
long ago either.
Yes, and so if you look at the layers of history, originally on that same site in 1902, Clutho built the City Hall, the great architect Clutho, and it was the grand masterpiece of Jacksonville architecture at the time. After 50 years, it had become out of style, passé, that old classical building with a dome on it. And so they tore it down and built the glistening, modern Hayden Burns Library. And then 50 years after it was built, again, the fashions changed and people wanted to tear it down. An 18-story condominium was destined to be built on the site of what is now the DuPont Center, which is the Hayden Burns Library. So,
sometimes called the Jessie these days, right? The Jessie.
Yes,
the name of the building.
They nicknamed it the Jessie, but it was amazingly at the last minute before the building was about to be torn down. It was purchased and later on put under the custody of the DuPont Fund, which lovingly restored it. And although it is no longer a library, the wonderful features of it that made it so attractive and keeps it attractive today is they retained all the beautiful colors, the murals, the fins, the very abstract design of the facade of this building.
Because there is this elaborate tile work inside and outside.
Local artist Ann Williams was the artist who designed these amazing glazed tile mosaics that are both on the inside and the outside of the building that add to its playfulness, to its modern, super modern image of that time, and add a colorful oasis in the middle of an otherwise bland downtown when this building was built. And I dare say 100 years from now, when architectural historians come to Jacksonville, they will want to see four buildings. One will be the Gulf Life Tower, another will be the Chart House, another will be the St. James Building, and of course, they'll want to see the Hayden Burns Library.
It is amazing that it was saved because it was very close. There wasn't a lot of appetite for saving it. As you say, people thought it was old-fashioned, tired, kind of very, looked of the past. But it's ironic that the person that was initially talking about building a condominium on that site is now the steward of three of the most historic buildings in downtown Jacksonville, the Laura Street Trio. Steve
Adkins and I have had many conversations about that and his conversion from being on the verge of tearing down one of our greatest buildings, and he's now the steward of the Laura Street Trio, three of our most precious historic buildings downtown, and hopefully we'll soon see progress on restoring those three buildings as among the most important historic buildings in downtown Jacksonville. And Taylor Hardwick, the architect of the library building, also designed Friendship Fountain, although it's kind of a shadow of what he originally designed in terms of the space. But he also liked to incorporate architectural elements that fed into or fed off of the Florida environment in terms of light but also kind of shadow that made it not so hot. He really was an advanced designer, and this building really encapsulates some of that. Well, he was, as you say, a genius at design, and the interplay of light and shadow. Color was one of his big themes, but also he loved to experiment with modern materials. Concrete blocks at that time were a fairly new innovation in homes especially. And he designed buildings where concrete became actually part of the decoration of the building as well as the structure of it. Sadly, he's gone now, but he was a great friend and one of Jacksonville's great architects after World War II.
Do you think that there's a lesson that we could take, especially given that there was this other building on that site that was by a renowned architect that was in its time also just thought to be incredible and beautiful, only to be replaced by this library, which nearly lost its life? First of all, are we getting beyond that sort of cyclical identity where we want to tear down and rebuild without appreciating history?
If you look at downtown and the hundreds of buildings that have been torn down, downtown is our greatest architectural crucible. After the fire, all those hundreds of new buildings were built. When I wrote the first copy of Jacksonville's Architectural Heritage in 1987, in the 12 years it took to write that book, 20% of the buildings got torn down. Take Riverside. In the night after the Great Fire, many people moved to Riverside and built great mansions that was the showplace of Jacksonville. 50 years later, they were out of style. They were too big for people to live in, so they got torn down. So after 50 years, after the start of Riverside Avondale preservation, I challenge people to say, don't take it for granted that these buildings will survive forever, because 50 years from now they may be passé and out of style. Once again, people don't want to live in those old buildings. So we must keep our resolve to appreciate our city's architecture as works of art that are worth cherishing and saving and passing on to future generations.
Are there any particular areas or styles of architecture right now that you think are vulnerable to that sense of let's just get rid of it and move on?
Well, not every building should be saved just because it's old, but we're now coming to appreciate two things. One, there are a lot of buildings that were not necessarily architectural landmarks when they were built, but because of their cultural history. Many of them, for example, in historic East Side, there's a little bungalow there you would drive by 100 times and never look at until you realize that was the home where Zora Neale Hurston lived. And so sometimes the cultural heritage is just as important as the architectural heritage of a building. And we need to seek out and find those buildings that are relative to our historic past so that we can pass them on to future generations and be able to explain them to future generations.
Well, Dr. Wayne Wood, author of Jacksonville's Architectural Heritage and historian, thank you so much for being here, as you have been, to catch us up on a little bit of Jacksonville history.
Thank you, Anna. It's always a pleasure.